Everybody, thank you for joining us. We're going to get started at 7:05. 7:05. I encourage everybody to utilize the chat channel if you guys want to. Um, you know, nothing profane, please. Keep it professional. Shouldn't have given you guys the idea. This is probably a mistake.
All right. So 7:05, I think we'll kick off unless anybody has any last minute technology issues. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, hackers, security professionals, and newbies, I'd like to welcome you to CSNP.org and Dallas Hackers Association April joint event. I'm your host, Sean Richards. And tonight we are doing a new format for us. It is Dallas Debate Night. The topic is, does the Earn It Act deserve your support? And I just want to start with some acknowledgments and announcements. So we've got some special guests. We have BrianSanders from the U.S. Secret Service, lots more from him a little bit later. Thanks to Wirefall and Philip Wiley, as well as Whiskey Neon from the Dallas Hackers Association. Then Dennis Ozment, Executive Director at For the One Foundation, Chair at the C7 Human Trafficking Coalition, and owner at Allegiant Investigations. For the One is dedicated to finding and recovering missing, exploited, and trafficked teens at no cost to families. That's the numeral 4the1.org. Dennis, do you want to tell people why you started For the One?
Yeah, unfortunately, in North Texas, we have hundreds of missing kids at any given time. And from our experience of the 169 we've helped locate over the past few years, about half of those are victims of human trafficking. And bottom line is law enforcement just does not have the resources or personnel to handle all of those cases. So we started a nonprofit. We have over 40 volunteers, 19 private investigators, all from the DFW and all the way down to Temple, Texas. And we work closely with law enforcement and families to help locate the kids, just to be more eyes, ears, and hands in order to get the job done, get the kids off the street and back to a safe place as quickly as possible.
Dennis, that's an incredible mission. Thank you for your support and for driving that. I believe you guys take donations at forthe1.org, and we'll put the URL in the chat. So I'd encourage anybody attending, if you're interested in supporting that cause, please go and make a donation. And then I wanted to say thank you to CSNP.org's national sponsors. So we have Guardicore for microsegmentation and security innovation, Elastic and Contrast Security, as well as our regional sponsors. So Tanium, who is my employer, and I'm ever grateful. So it's an endpoint platform for unified management and security. And then JetBrains is a supporting community sponsor. They provide amazing development tools, and they sponsor communities and organizations all over the country. A couple of announcements. So we've got a new national innovation program. So this is our research and development team, and we are looking for volunteers to contribute to open source security projects sponsored by CSNP.org. Coding, documentation, and testing is primarily what we're looking for volunteers. Although right now it's still in an early stage. So if you want to contribute architecture or ideation, I think that's more than welcome as well. And a couple of regional programs. So Chuck and the rest of the team also work on Dallas Hack the Box 2020. So our next event is this Friday, May 1st at 6 p.m. And you can register there. Just search for Hack the Box on meetup.com. And then national volunteering opportunity. If any of you compliance folks have a CPA background, CSNP.org is looking for a national treasurer. And we just want to make sure we're handling all our dollars and our accountability correctly for our members and sponsors. And a little bit after the debate, there will be a feedback poll, and if you enter the poll, we also have a raffle, which will follow the Q&A. And then I would like to hand it over to Brian. So BrianSanders is a network intrusion response agent with the United Secret Service Dallas field office, and he's on the Electronic Crimes Task Force. He's been an agent with the Secret Service for almost 20 years, and he's worked with the electronic crimes cases for more than 14 of those years. During his tenure with the Secret Service, Agent Sanders has been the case agent for investigations involving network intrusion, ransomware, email compromise, and child exploitation. And Agent Sanders has also participated in dozens of tabletop exercises, panel discussions, and cybersecurity presentations in and around the Metroplex, as well as presenting from frontline workers all the way to IT management and executives. Agent Sanders is a native Texan, a graduate of Texas A&M, and formerly Houston PD. So, Brian, thank you for your years of service, and please take it away.
Thanks very much, Sean. I really appreciate it, and I want to thank you and CSNP for the opportunity inviting me to come and do this. I think it's a great opportunity to participate with a diverse group, talking about something that's important at all levels. So I just want to go into what we're going to talk about a little bit tonight. The eliminating abusive or rampant neglect of interactive technologies, or so-called Earn It bill, is currently in Congress right now. It was a bill that was put forth by both a Democrat and a Republican, and actively supported by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. So, for most people, looking at just the basics on this bill, I mean, it seems like a no-brainer. I mean, who wouldn't advocate for the safety and welfare of our children? On the other side, you have the privacy and freedom of speech advocates who see the potential and opportunity for the government and law enforcement with this bill to reduce freedoms using the disguise of combating sexual trafficking and child exploitation. So with this bill, some previous legislation that's going to be affected are two things. The Communication Decency Act, which was passed in 1996, and essentially this is an act talking about the continued development of the internet and for free market and universal good for free speech. This is a bill that's potentially affected by this new Earn It bill. And then more importantly, and I think more that we'll touch on a little bit more what we're going to talk about tonight, is the CALEA Act, which is the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act from 1994. And this is, as cops, this is what we call the Wiretap Act. And back when this was passed, the primary consideration were landlines and then cell phones, because, we didn't have encrypted communication over the internet. So as those communications have changed, you see a lot of complications that may develop, because the Wiretap Act actually mandated that phone service providers provided access to law enforcement when wiretaps were authorized by the judicial system. And so, again, as communications like this, I mean, if it's an encrypted communication that's not tappable, then, that actually violates the CALEA Act. And so the Earn It bill, it's kind of interesting to see, you know, how some of the changes that may come about with this bill affect this previous legislation. So the format we've got tonight, we're going to have 35 minutes for arguments from both sides. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and then we're going to come back and do some Q&A with our panelists here. And so what I'd like to do next is introduce our panelists. On the affirmative side, we have Chuck Peters, who is president of the Dallas chapter of CSNP and a longtime advocate of free expression and critical thinking. He lives locally here in Dallas, Texas, and has worked in technology, cloud security, and servant leadership for 15 years. And on the other side, the opposition side, we have Whiskey Neon, and he is a co-organizer and a longtime member of the Dallas Hackers Association. He is well known for his passionate advocacy of privacy, his brilliant technical skills, and his outstanding reputation in the offensive security community. So to get us started, we're going to have Chuck. Chuck, you are the original or the initial argument on the affirmative side, and you have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Sean. And most of all, thank you to my members and to those who are new to CSNP. Welcome. So what I'd like to start out with today is I'd like to start out with discussing some facts. So a fact is that in 1998, 3,000 reports of child sexual abuse imagery were given to law enforcement regarding the internet. In 2008, there were over 100,000 reports. In 2014, there were 1 million. In 2018, there were 18.4 million. In 2019, there were 45 million reports of child sexual abuse imagery on the internet. In that same amount of time, there was an 846% increase in reports of child sex trafficking from the years 2010 to 2015. Some other facts. Internet companies and tech companies have to report, oh man, this is my first time doing this. I'm getting a little tongue-tied. Internet companies have to report to law enforcement any apparent child pornography that they are aware of, quote, end quote, and they have to retain that evidence for a period of 90 days. Unfortunately, that period of 90 days is typically not enough time to actually engage law enforcement, and much of that evidence ends up getting destroyed. Furthermore, how companies gather and report these violations of the law are not standardized across platforms, and introspection into a company's own platform could disrupt or destroy their brand. I want you to think, for example, if a major company, say like the Facebook, were to come out with a report of 700 million images of child pornography available on their platform, how would that affect their brand? In my opinion, this leads to a very inescapable conclusion, and that is that legitimate platforms need oversight. Platforms at this time do not have sufficient regulation or standards according to their scale, and the self-regulation which they currently employ is just not good enough. Tech companies have no incentive to advocate or cooperate to serve the victims of our communities. Furthermore, we have to consider the context of this problem is not just our neighborhoods, it's not our states or our counties, it's not even our nation, it is global. And we have to have the fact that most victims are never going to have justice sit upon our conscience. Legitimate platforms that the USA, that reside within the USA, facilitate the victimization of children, whether intentionally or not. Law enforcement is besieged and hamstrung by inadequate legislation, manpower, expertise, and tools. This content lives on the internet forever and in abundance. Finally, I would like you to consider a comparative case. Financial institutions are a major component of the internet. These institutions are highly regulated, highly introspective, and must comply with the oversight of many federal bureaucracies. We should ask ourselves, why is it that victims of financial crime can get so much oversight, yet the victims of child exploitation cannot? It is a fact that the internet is not the same as it was in 1996. Global platforms consumed by billions of people require oversight and standardized best practices. Brian, how am I doing on time?
You still got over 5 minutes. You're good.
Okay, so I would like to delve a little bit into the legislation that Brian mentioned earlier, specifically the progression of where legislation was in 1996 and where it is today. So let's talk a little bit about the Section 230 Safe Harbor Act of 1996. This foundational law of the internet has my respect because it made initially platforms immune from the liability for their content, excepting in cases of child pornography. The ability for a platform to be immune from its content has created such names, such household names as Facebook, Amazon.com, Twitter, Grindr, like you name it, okay? The platform just provides a medium for individuals to exchange information and services. Almost every major platform that we consider a foundational internet platform today exists because of the Safe Harbor Act of 1996. However, the Safe Harbor Act came with lots of problems. These problems were addressed in further legislation such as the Save 2014 Act, which made receiving revenue from ads for trafficked children illegal. The Protect Act of 2008, which at the moment I can't remember what that did, but it was important. I think, oh yeah, that's right. It created the cyber tip line, which required the reporting of child pornography found on sites by the platforms. Most recently, there was the SESTA-FOSTA Act of 2018, which made it illegal to assist, facilitate, or support sex trafficking. And you can see that the Earn It Act is really just a progression of the compliance framework required, not requested, but required by the victims of sexual exploitation. Finally, I'd like to close with a simple message. The Earn It Act will hurt criminals, help victims, and restore lives. It is time that we recognize the internet for what it has become, and that is a major force in everyday life. These platforms that you and I use are beyond the stage where they need to innovate to create market share. They are at the stage where they need to innovate to help their communities and to help victims live better lives. And I surrender the balance of my time.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Chuck, for your words. Coming up next, we have Whiskey Neon. Whiskey Neon, you're the opening opposition statement, and your 10 minutes starts now.
All right, thank you. First off, I'm hearing echo on someone's mic. Sorry, that's going to mess me up. All right. First off, I just want to say thank you for everyone that's involved right now, that we're allowed to have this open forum. And this is very important. And I feel that the opposition argument for this is, for technologists, really easy to take. But for people who don't understand technology to the depths that we do in security, you may look at us kind of confused as to why we would be against helping, the victims of these terrible crimes. So the real key to all of this, and the reason why we can all come here and have a conversation, is because we all seek the same thing. We're not opposed at anything here. What we're actually seeking here is justice. Now, how we go about getting that justice is what this debate's really about. And my argument is that this law doesn't actually provide justice. It's really kind of a slap in the face, in my opinion, when people offer these condolence prizes of legislation instead of actually looking at the root causes behind it. And it's easy to go after technology. It's really hard to understand. But let's take that away from it, and let's look at if we were to apply this to guns or cash. Two things that Americans know really well, right? So we know the Second Amendment debate is very, very just divided in our country, and there's a plethora of reasons why. But one thing that Americans typically are against is this idea of every single gun in America being registered. One, because it would be almost impossible to pull that off. I know plenty of people who can't even tell me how many guns they own. So rounding all of these up and being able to have this big data of what every gun is in America, that seems like something that would probably cause people to get out in the streets, hopefully without their guns. Now we have cash. That's another thing, right? Where if we really look at the root cause of a lot of these things that we create these amazing laws for that continue to strip our civil liberties away, it's cash, right? Like, think about it. We have terrorist acts. We have illicit drug trade. We have all of this illicit human trafficking trades. This comes back to cash. Why don't we look at a solution of eliminating all anonymous financial options for the United States? Because if we did this, we could actually track all of that stuff. But if you propose this, it would sound preposterous to the American populace, because it is. Because you're eroding something called privacy that's very important to us. And along with this, we have a ton of unintended consequences. With the act named FOSTA that he mentioned earlier, one of the things that happened after that occurred when that law came into place was that it's really targeting a site called Backpage.com. And when Backpage.com was removed from the internet, sure, the United States got a little win. We kicked a Dallas-based company that was providing a huge amount of infrastructure for this exact problem. But at the same time, it was probably the biggest law enforcement tool that was available, because at the time, you could buy ads on Backpage with your credit card, and then law enforcement could use those credit card transactions to actually go and bust these rings. Then one sheriff had a smart idea one day to get the credit card companies to stop taking these transactions. And what happened after that is that they switched to Bitcoin. That's when law enforcement starts losing, because we'll always win this battle. We're the technologists. We can pivot. We create new things. Law enforcement has to comply with laws that are written by people who don't understand this role. So when you look at Bitcoin, you have a ton of big data problem, right? Where you could look at financial transactions from credit card companies, but now with Bitcoin, it is a huge, huge data analysis problem. So that's really the big thing here, is when we look at the big data problem that is going to be caused by this. And so I'm going to quote something here, and this is kind of the point of my argument. Is it's from this essay titled "Designing Organizations for an Information-Rich World." The political scientist Herbert Simon says, "In an information-rich world, the wealth of information means a dearth of something else, a scarcity of whatever it is that information consumes. What information consumes is rather obvious. It consumes the attention of its recipients. Hence, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention and the need to allocate the attention efficiently among the overabundance of information sources that might consume it." AKA, it's not finding a needle in a haystack, it's throwing 5 needles in a hayfield and trying to find them then. And how much time do I have right now?
You've got a little over 4 minutes.
All right, cool. So when we look at this like this haystack problem, we can look at our national security agency as an example of the problem with the needles in the haystack. If you look at leaked NSA internal documents, they talk about this big problem where they have all of this data. There's so much noise, so much false positives. What are we supposed to do about all of this? Now, if we look at the mechanisms in which we have today, in which reporting is done, and then after that you have actionable data, the false positive rate's going to be way lower because it's a lot of the manual entry, right? But once we have this huge dragnet apparatus available, well, what are we going to do to actually find the useful information? It's a common problem that signals intelligence has to deal with all the time, and we're entrusting this with whom? A nonprofit organization that's acting on behalf of the federal government? This sounds insane because the NSA is not even doing a good job at protecting their secrets, as Snowden told us, which is my reference for this whole needle in the haystack thing the NSA is dealing with. They couldn't keep those documents out. So how can we possibly look at ensuring this type of, global surveillance, even though it's inside of the United States, we kind of run the internet by and large. This type of thing is something that we need to consider. And aside from just this, privacy thing, I'll get into that later, but what we have to focus on is, can we trust the security of these systems? The NSA has had their tools hacked and used against the world. WannaCry, the biggest ransomware thing that made the news, it took out the UK's National Health Service, and they were using tools from the one organization that's supposed to protect us and our secrets the most. It's kind of like going into an arcade, going up to an arcade cabinet, and that's a website, and the arcade's the internet. And law enforcement's playing at this arcade called Whack-A-Mole. And the idea of this game is there's 80 moles in the cabinet, but only 5 of these bad guys get out. And law enforcement is just sitting there hitting these moles constantly, trying to eliminate these threats. And what they're asking for is to open up a door in the back of this arcade cabinet, pull all of the moles out, and then somehow figure out which ones were the ones sticking their heads out. You're going to cause a bigger challenge in your endeavor. And let's not forget, after Backpage went down, all of these services pivoted to offshore bulletproof systems. So an unintended consequence of that is that also people pivot to dating sites and using other applications that were never used for prostitution before. And these companies don't necessarily know that they're participating in facilitating prostitution. One example that may not even be publicly disclosed right now, but due to my work with sex workers, I'm aware of this legitimate app called Mr. Number. And it's designed so that you could have like a group caller ID. So if someone calls you with a spam number, you can say that it's, a bill collector or whatever. They use this app to look up clients' numbers, potential clients' numbers, to see if any other workers have been raped or murdered or, well, obviously not murdered, that was a bad example, but like robbed or whatever may have occurred. They can have this platform to remain safe. And these aren't necessarily evil people. These are just people who happen to be prostitutes, individual workers. This is a tool that they use to protect themselves. And right now, Mr. Number could be considered a bad service. They could be liable for something they had no idea or never intended their platform to be used for. That's the kind of unintended consequences we have to consider. And I hope that we all think about in this conversation tonight. And I am receding my time or whatever the phrase is. I don't know. I didn't watch enough of this stuff. Oh, I'm good. That's all I needed to say.
Very good. Thanks, Whiskey Neon. Very interesting. So now we're going to move back to Chuck Peters with a rebuttal. Chuck, your 5 minutes starts now.
All right. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Whiskey. As you know, I have a lot of respect for the work that you do and for the opinions that you have. I'd like to start tearing your argument apart with the guns and cash argument. So first of all, I would like everyone to consider quo bono, right? Who benefits if this legislation doesn't pass? Who benefits if the legislation does pass? One of the things that brought my attention to this issue in the first place was that almost all the material I was finding online was very one-sided against the Earn It Act. And hearing the voice of, well, why would a bunch of senators and Congress people and whatever, why would a bunch of lawmakers waste all their time putting this act forward if there was nothing good about it? And I think that it's important to think of how much it would cost the major platforms to become introspective on child exploitation. Now, I don't have any numbers on what that would be, but you can assume that it might launch an entirely new industry. Is that industry good? Is that industry bad? I don't know, but it is important to ask who benefits. Furthermore, we talked a lot about eroding privacy. This argument, I don't know if it holds water for me personally, because the major platforms that I consider would be subject to this law or would participate in this law, they already are exploiting your privacy. There's the lack of control of your personal information is probably one of the most paramount crises that we're facing as the internet generation. And I think it's very important for us to think about, well, how since we've already surrendered our privacy, how can we enable that lack of privacy to stop child predators? Another example that Whiskey and I talk about often is Backpage.com. The summary of this argument to me comes to organized crime is easier to bust than disorganized crime. And I believe this to be true, but does that mean that I believe that there should be organized crime? No, I don't believe that there should be. And then lastly, I want to talk about the data analysis problem. I believe that Whiskey Neon is absolutely correct when he says that this is going to create a flood of data and that we will, in fact, be suffering from a wealth of information, which will create a poverty of attention. However, I believe that due to the bill's reliance on the private sector, that we might actually be creating an entirely new market for innovation. And I think that that's something that we can think about. And I yield the balance of my time.
Okay, very good. Thanks very much, Chuck. And next we'll have Whiskey Neon coming back with the opposition rebuttal, and you'll have 5 minutes, sir, and you may begin.
Alrighty. So when we look at the concept of privacy and we think about that, I have a Facebook account, might come as a surprise to people, but there's like 5 people that I still talk to on there because I can't get them to get on a better platform, right? And so when I look at the platform that I have forced almost anyone who wants to communicate me to use, Signal, that is my social network. So as a lot of people are removing themselves from Facebook and moving to another just as invasive platform, we want to make sure, of course, we want to push for laws that protect our privacy there. But in this case, the way that we're going about doing this is literally violating your Fourth Amendment rights. Because what this is doing is the government is placing this nonprofit organization, giving them the authority, kind of bypassing this whole PRISM problem that they had to begin with. So you have this nonprofit organization that is, the way that they're trying to explain this is that there's a couple of options where if your message is sent on Facebook today is going to be searched and analyzed to do who knows what, right? And you're right about that. It's a big problem. So when they're doing that, that's when the government's saying that it's okay to start looking at this data for this type of violations and be able to send it to this database and have it reported. Another option is that because of an encryption, you know, they're saying that this isn't going to break into an encryption. Well, if you have a client on your computer, an agent, one of the suggested alternatives where they scan for content before you send it out, there's no point of having end-to-end encryption. And if you feel like that tired argument of if you have nothing wrong going on, what do you have to hide as far as privacy? Remember that privacy is a pure privilege. Most of us have the privilege of being able to sacrifice our privacy, but there are millions of people in the world who need to have privacy for whatever reason it may be, either mental health or actual physical health. And so privacy is something that we cannot sacrifice for corporate interests or even for interests that we are really passionate about like this one. It's just not worth it at the end of the day. And also, we should be able to choose whether or not we're opting into systems like this. Because in reality, all of our communications are run by corporations today. And the government having this kind of buddy-buddy organization with them, it's not like Kalea 2.0. This is something different. Kalea actually is a great mechanism, but breaking encryption is not a possibility, one, for some of these things, as far as we know today. And two, if you do it, you basically break the way that we use the internet. And I give back my time.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Whiskey Neon. And so Actually, you have, since the affirmative side with Chuck Peters had the initial comment and the opening statement, you will have the last word. So you have 5 more minutes and you may start now.
All right. So in closing, I would like for us to really focus on the root causes of these issues, because technology is a tool. When I was talking about cash and guns, the real analogy there is that those are just tools. And is it really fair to blame cash for terrorism? I mean, a lot of people like to blame guns for things, but it's at the end of the day, we still hold the person who pulls the trigger responsible. And instead of looking at technology as being responsible, it's indifferent. We are the problem, and so we have to go to the root cause of these issues. One of the big ones for me is that I believe that the way that we treat illegal aliens is a big part of our problem here. Illegal aliens find themselves in these compromising positions constantly, and the communities there are ripe for exploitation. It doesn't really help our communities when people are being gaslit into fear to be in these exploited positions only for us to not have any empathy for their unfortunate circumstances. And when you see people getting locked in literal cages for the way that, you know, they just are in this country, illegal status, I would probably be petrified if I was in one of these scenarios. It feels like a lose-lose. And even though they're in a really bad situation that some terrible people might say they put themselves in, it's where we need to have a little bit of empathy. And we need to start looking at the illegal alien issue and the human trafficking issue with more compassion and empathy than what we currently do. And legalizing sex work is another potential option for helping this out. The nice sex workers that I talk to that are just as passionate about wanting to eradicate this filth from their industry, it's kind of heartbreaking to see that, like, just like hackers, where the CFAA is a terrible piece of legislation that makes me villainized by society, she also has to have the same thing, or he has to do the same thing. And so if we can legalize some of these things, this now allows law enforcement efforts to be allocated towards the people who are operating outside of this. They have multiple billion-dollar industries involving all of this illicit things. If we start legalizing some of it and regulating it, we can start focusing on the people who are actually being exploited. And we also have to understand the frustrating job that law enforcement has, this endless game of whack-a-mole. And I understand it, you know, they're just sitting there at that machine, whacking away until their arms exhausted. And now they're just begging to get in the back door. That's something I can relate to, but we can't just easily open up the floodgates for the eradication of our Fourth Amendment rights. It comes back to justice. What is justice? Is it looking at our constitutional framework and working from it? Most people would say yes. And when you start violating the Constitution, we need to start talking about, okay, well, maybe we don't want to live in the world that we decided 200 years ago. But if that's going to be our legal framework, then we need to respect it. And violating the Fourth Amendment for whatever reason is kind of one of the things that our country was founded upon, that some things are not worth giving up regardless, because we know that the road to tyranny starts with this little tiny trail. And it's important that we don't relinquish our rights in that regard. But in closing, since my argument will probably fall on deaf ears, and this law will probably pass anyways, I'll just go ahead and give my congratulations to the affirmative. If you believe that this bill is worthy of passing, then you have to accept the unintended consequences that most likely will put more people at harm and make this world a worse place than it already is. So with that, I say congratulations. You earned it. And that is it.
Nice closing. Nice closing. Well stated, sir. So we've had some really good discussion here. We're going to take, well, Chuck, do you want me to go from here? It looks like we're going to take a 15-minute break now, I believe. I'm going to compile some Q&A questions based on the chat and other questions that some of our audience have sent in. So if you haven't sent anything in, you've been listening, raptly engaged with the conversation here, start sending those questions. I'm going to put some things together that we can talk about when we come back. I think we've got a 15-minute piece here where we may have a raffle and some other things. So get some water, go to the bathroom, send me some questions, and we'll wrap it up. Okay.
Hey everyone, so it's 7:02. It's about time to get back. So let me kick on my video here real quick. So thank you guys for filling out the poll. I think we're ready to go directly into Q&A. Brian, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I'm good to go if you're ready.
I'm ready. Whiskey, you ready?
You know it.
All right, let's do it.
Okay. I just want to take this opportunity. I mean, this has been a great discussion. I mean, obviously I'm on the law enforcement side, but you know, I have a law enforcement hat, and I mean, I want my privacy protected too. I mean, I have a, you know, family and all of the freedoms that we all enjoy. Just because, you know, I'm a cop doesn't mean that I don't want those for myself as well. And I certainly don't want to violate those for somebody else in the same situation. So you know, this discussion is really interesting. Because, you know, as a cop, I mean, I've put a lot of child predators in jail. I'll tell you right now. I mean, that's one of the things that I've done in Secret Service. And, you know, to me, those kinds of people need to be off the street. And, you know, I don't want my kids victimized or anybody else's kids. And I've seen enough of these types of cases, seen the victims, seen the families, and see the far-reaching consequences. So, you know, it's really important. I mean, this is a significant issue. But, you know, the question becomes, you know, what do we sacrifice in order to make those things happen? And so I think it's the discussion we generated here is really interesting. So I want to go to some of the questions that we've got from some of the audience members. I think there's some really good discussion in here. I'm going to start off with this, and I'm not going to name who I put some of these questions together from several chat messages and questions that were issued. So I'm not going to name who listed the question, but if, let's say this act passes, and we do not end up harming, you know, the encryption systems that the companies are using, do you think we could see innovations or advances in the industry as a result of this bill?
Me or him?
Either one of you guys. I don't have a preference.
So I think
right,
we should trade off. So like Whiskey, why don't you answer this one first? I'll answer the next one first, like that.
Okay.
Okay, sounds cool. So on the question of if it doesn't break encryption, you know, there could be all this innovation and stuff. That's, you know what? Let's say magically that this isn't going to have some requirement for an encryption backdoor. Let's just say that it's exactly the dream that they want it to be. Here's the problem with it. We have the thing called the Fourth Amendment that this is still totally violating. So, like, understand that the Fourth Amendment is all right, here's the reality. Right now, there's this webcam that I'm talking into. I've got a cell phone. I've got all of these devices around me right now. And all of these are private companies that are able to collect all this data that the U.S. government cannot legally do, and none of us would tolerate if they did. And so allowing them to use those service providers to then be able to siphon off data and you know, do dragnet surveillance, essentially, this is, without probable cause, violation of our Fourth Amendment rights. It should never be tolerated.
Okay, interesting. Chuck, next one for you. I had a couple of points here. You know, as far one listener was talking about the scope paragraph that allows the commission to recommend best practices. Do you see the vagueness in the language of the bill potentially leading to abuse?
This is a very good question because there is potential for abuse. There is also potential for not abuse. I think that people get really hung up on what the bill could possibly be used for. And they forget that, you know, there's quite a bit of, I mean, there's a committee being put together specifically to oversee the execution and policing of this bill. You know, Brian, you and I had talked about that in the past. And so for us to look at this bill and say that we have to roundly reject it because the language is open doesn't seem like a viable argument, because the language is left intentionally open so that the bill can be shaped by that committee.
Okay, interesting.
Can I rebut that real quick?
Sure.
So one of the things that we have to understand about that committee is who gets to be on the committee, which we have no idea. Look, I don't have a problem with having committees in which we decide how open-ended legislation should be formed. And the key to this, though, is that I understand victim advocates out there. I understand law enforcement. I do understand where you're coming from. And we need to have this dialogue in those exact committees. But how many of me are going to be in that committee? How many people who are going to be from the hacktivist side or the technologist side? Is it just going to be corporations getting handpicked by these legislators? That's something we have to figure out, is how many people, like who these people are going to be on that committee, because that's not determined yet.
Very good point. Yeah, I mean, you want a well-rounded group of individuals from all aspects of the situation so they can be policed better. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, would it not make sense to have a sex worker advocate be on that board? That's the type of thing. We need to have that balance so that we have that well-rounded understanding when we make these decisions that have such huge consequences for everything that we know.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, so moving on. So, Whiskey Neil, I want to come back to you now, actually, with another question. So, had a participant talk about how we can address the fact that there are numerous tools available for use and are maybe not used by the investigators, or the investigators do not have the technological skills or training to use those tools. Could you see a partnership between law enforcement and, for lack of a better term, the hacking community, you know, to work together against child predators and child traffickers?
This is exactly the reason why this type of discussion excites me, is because, again, it's about that pursuit of justice. For me, I do not really care about what laws say half the time, right? But I'm always in pursuit of justice. I'm not someone who wants to see illegal crimes occur where, you know, people's bank accounts are being, you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not advocating those types of things. Where the laws are wrong and the right thing to do is to cross that boundary, hackers a lot of times are up to do it. And there's a lot of us who are willing to cross lines that law enforcement would throw us in jail for crossing, but they can't cross themselves. And we have the skills and the knowledge to do it. But the big problem is that we're commonly at odds with law enforcement, just like sex workers who want to be your allies, because of the fact that the way the laws have been written, we're scared shitless of all law enforcement. I mean, I have nightmares about raids since I was a teenager, and it's a reoccurring dream. And it's really hard for me to even sit down and think, oh, my first solution is going to law enforcement, much like a lot of other people out there. And so building bridges is very important, and understanding that the just causes in the world far outweigh, like, you know, some, you know, fear I might have about getting busted doing what needs to be done to get that person recovered. And so, yes, I think there's a great opportunity if law enforcement is willing to kind of build that bridge with us. I know we would love to see that happen.
So Chuck, you got something to add?
Yeah, if I might comment on that. So certainly there's a role for for hacktivists and for activists. But what the future that I see is a future where that activism occurs within the boundary of a legal framework. I want to bring this back to a comparison with the financial industry. What we have is we have a great example of an industry on the internet which is highly regulated, highly introspective, and that employs a lot of people in keeping it that way. And then on the other side, we have activity which is not highly regulated, not highly introspective, and doesn't employ a lot of people keeping it that way. And the reason that I keep coming back to this example is because I ask myself, well, why is it that finance is so highly regulated and compliant and child exploitation is not? And I think that it has to come down to the fact of who the victims are. The victims of financial exploitation get their voices heard. The victims of child exploitation do not. And I think that establishing a framework where we can be activists in a part of the economy, I think that could make a lot of difference.
Okay, Chuck, I'm going to come back to you now if I can. So had a point made by a listener here. The check and balance system is in place, for law enforcement and government through the judicial system, obviously in the court system. Do you think that this bill would circumvent that check and balance system that's already in place?
I'm very interested about the implication of this question. I think that the private sector is often in partnership with governance. I think that it's very difficult for law enforcement to do their job if they don't have the participation and involvement of not only the private sector, but also of non-governmental organizations. I think the best example of that might be the Fed or other NGOs which facilitate the actions of government within the borders of the United States and without. I find it hard to believe that a law would upend the very framework in which it was established. But stranger things have happened. I'd really like to know more about the implications of that question.
Whiskey Neon, do you have anything to add?
I mean, it goes back to history repeats itself. And, when we look at the lessons that we've learned from history and how these things end up turning out, I mean, we don't have to look too far back. Everything changed after 9/11. And the way that we view problem solving in this country relies way too heavily, I feel, on the companies to be the ones responsible for this, when society is the reason why all of this is existing to begin with. So it goes back to root causes. And I don't think that, private industry is always going to be the answer. And that's coming from someone who's relatively libertarian, even though, I'm not trying to be political. I'm just saying that this isn't money, right? Like, this isn't a financial thing. This is human life. And so that's a little different when you look at how we have to frame that, because the implications of getting it wrong, and from my viewpoint of potentially making this worse, that's what I'm most concerned with outside of the Fourth Amendment thing. I think you're putting fuel on the fire with this.
Understood. So if I can, I'm going to go back to you with a final question, Chuck, if that's all right. So do you see, Whiskey Neon, do you see a potential economic impact if companies that are affected by this legislation move their facilities outside of the U.S. in order, to avoid the restrictions?
Yeah, so if we look at what happened with FOSTA, almost immediately it was a huge concern for otherwise legitimate websites. One in particular is an adult hookup dating site thing called FetLife, right? And they were concerned with FOSTA because the way that this is written, being in the niche audience that they are in, were highly concerned about if they could even operate in the United States. And for me personally, like I mentioned earlier, Signal is the app that I recommend for people to remain safe. for journalists, for just everyone that I know, especially for people who could be potentially victimized, like closeted homosexuals in very aggressive areas, or other people who might be at risk of getting killed for being the way they are. That is those things that are usually American things, where we think that we export freedom out to the world, and to literally make a law that exports all of our freedom-loving services away. I could totally see that happening. But in all honesty, the economic impact of this is the corporations that everyone uses, Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, all of those services, will continue to make money. They're not going to leave the country. But all of the really good, innovative stuff, you're not incentivized anymore to be in this country. So I would be looking elsewhere if I were one of them.
Chuck?
I like this question because what it identifies is that it identifies a larger pattern in the global economy. And that is, as an innovative industry matures, that innovative industry becomes subject to regulation. That regulation makes doing business more expensive, and therefore that innovative industry will look to house itself in other nations to maintain profitability. I think that this is an inescapable pattern of the way that business is done. I don't think that it's going to, that if we were to regulate an industry, that industry is necessarily going to abandon the United States. But people who are interested in protecting the secrets of child exploitation very well may leave. I don't know if I have such a big problem with that. I think I would be okay with people who are trying to protect the privacy of sex traffickers and child exploiters. I wouldn't have a problem with them leaving. Now, there's a lot of, obviously there's a lot of gray area there, and we're taking a lot of if that, then this, kind of assumptions. But I do like the question because it does identify that general pattern of the economy. And yeah, it is possible that more regulation makes doing business in the United States more expensive. But it's a cost that we always bear the burden of in a maturing industry.
Gotcha. Do we have time for another question? Do you want to wrap up? What's your take, Chuck?
I think we're good for another question.
Okay. So let me stick with you. As far as we were discussing the scope a little bit earlier of the commission, and a little bit of the vagueness, but can you see the commission expanding the scope? Once this bill is passed, say the commission is formed, can you see them expanding the scope to obtain material that is not CSAM or child sexual abuse material? Private information, whatever it is.
I like that one because this is kind of a straw man that comes up in this discussion a lot. None of your data is private right now anyway. Like, everybody thinks that they have this like inalienable like private identity, but we as citizens of the internet sacrificed that private identity a long time ago. And that data has been for sale for many, many years now. Do I think that this is going to create any greater infringement upon that? Not really, no. I think that law enforcement, just as with carnivore, just as with, some of the other introspective technologies that have come out of the NSA, they're not looking for citizens to interfere in their private lives. And I think sex workers are a good example here. The real target is the bad guys with $4 million or 4 million pictures of torture of 3-year-olds on their hard drives. Those are the people that law enforcement will target, not searching. All right, I'm going to stop right there.
Whiskey Neon, you got something for us?
Yeah, it really comes down to this. The reason why we don't have privacy online is because, again, people don't realize what they're doing. Do you read the terms of service for every website you sign up? No, you probably don't. And you don't realize what you're agreeing to or what you're selling away. But we do in the real life. I'm wearing clothes right now. Why? Because I respect my privacy. And you know what? Y'all are all happy because I do it. Well, there's probably a few that are upset. But the point is that we have blinds. We have privacy. Why, if we're so open to being this transparent world, we get so pissed off about when our privacy is violated? We want transparency through institutions, but as personal individual people, we value privacy. And you have to ask yourself, why do we value it? Why do you personally not walk around naked? Why do we as a society view this as something that's important? It's either you go all in or you need to respect it. We just go completely transparent and we all instantly become honest overnight and just don't have any hangups with anyone. Or, you know, we have to live in a world that we actually live in which privacy is a necessity, because I don't want to see all my neighbors and they definitely don't want to see me. And when it comes to the government, I feel just the same way. I don't want to see an NSA analyst looking at any potential intimate photos that are sent to me, because that's between me and someone else. That's intimacy. And if you are violating my bedroom digitally, then that is just as invasive as you watching someone have sex in their bedroom. And if that's what we're doing here, we're sacrificing some really crazy things because we can't comprehend that this is more of our brains now than our actual brains half the time. So it's very important that we realize that the digital space is freedom's real last shot. And when we don't take these laws seriously, the implications is that, yes, we don't have privacy online. And all of my thoughts that I put together to put this together where y'all are hearing this for the first time, how many companies already knew my entire argument beforehand? And when you think about the government and potential dissent against an authoritative government, we need to be able to organize. We need to be able to communicate and educate one another so that our society doesn't even get to that point. But if we feel that the government's really watching us all the time, it changes your behavior. It changes everything about how you think, how you act, and that is not something that we should ever sacrifice in our country.
Good point. Good point. So, Chuck, I'm going to wrap up with this, and this is a concept that Whiskey Neon introduced earlier in his one of his segments, talking about, if you have nothing to hide, then why are you worried? I think that's a concept that we take advantage of a little bit. As law enforcement, I hear that all the time. I mean, I'll be honest with you. And obviously the context is indicative there of what exactly you're talking about. But Chuck, can you tell me a little bit about what your thoughts are as far as, from the privacy side of this, and protecting your privacy, what the boundaries are there for, people that want to have their privacy, but then they want to catch the bad guys too.
I like that a lot. Actually, these three questions are all kind of coming to a confluence. And that is, do we think that the law could be open for abuse? Do we believe that that it could be used to find other material other than it's intended, right? And do we believe that the invasion of privacy is justified because if you have nothing to hide, then you shouldn't be afraid? I want to go ahead and be on the record that I vehemently disagree with the idea that if you have nothing to hide, then you should have nothing to fear. I think every human being should have a healthy fear of not only authority, but authority's ability to have insight into your information and to lie about what that insight is to society at large. I think that you can just as easily become a victim of your government as a participant in your government. And I think that we see this played out we've seen this played out over many cases of authoritarian governments that have great, ability to enforce the law, but then the law becomes arbitrary, right? There's a great quote by a poet that wrote a book called A Man for All Seasons, where two of the characters are having a dispute about the law, and one of them asks the other, he says, if the laws were trees, would you cut down the trees to get at the devil? And he says, by God, I'd cut down every tree in England. And the other character says, that's the problem. The trees are not there to protect the devil. The trees are there to protect you.
Interesting. Whiskey Neon, I know this was your idea, and you brought it up to us. Do you have something to add?
Yeah, so the idea that if you have, that privacy is basically something that we should all respect, because the people who typically advocate that privacy isn't important, that if you have nothing to hide, why do you need privacy? It's because of the privilege that they have, right? And if we think about this, even right now, you may think to yourself that you're not doing anything wrong. But the reality is that in this country, we have in the past taken and crossed lines because we were scared about some shit. And it was called World War II, when the Japanese were thrown into camps. And how did they know where the Japanese people lived? Because of U.S. Census data that is protected by law and not supposed to be shared with other parts of the government. But that didn't matter because we were afraid at the time. Now, all of those people that were put into internment camps at the time, they probably thought before that happened that they had nothing to hide. But yet, even just something as simple as their race was something that they should have had kept secret. And we see that time and time again. As much as we like to think that we're always the heroes of the situation in America, we forget how often we scare ourselves into some tyrannical nightmare scenarios. And it's just not necessary. When we can respect privacy and guard ourselves and know that we have that responsibility when things go wrong, as long as we have protected ourselves however we need to, because privacy and security go hand in hand. These types of threats, if we remember these, hopefully it won't happen again in the future. And those are history lessons that we hear and we know about, but we don't think about it when we're writing tech legislation. Because who was thinking about internment camps when they wrote this law? They were thinking about the children. But that's the point, is that it starts off with being something to save us, but it ends up being terrible for a lot of different people. So privacy is important.
Great point and great discussion. Chuck, I'm out of questions.
No problem. Sean, are you around?
He is not. He had a.
You want to do the raffle?
Absolutely. Who's ready for the raffle? I hope everyone is. Awesome. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So these are all the individuals that filled out the poll. So thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and click on the wheel of names. And our first winner is Paul. Congratulations, Paul. You win a copy of excuse me. Gene Kim's The Unicorn Project. So congratulations. All right. And we have Jonathan Handler. who is also the lucky recipient of the Unicorn Project as well. So we also have 2 more additional prizes, each of them being a $25 Amazon gift card. Whoop, whoop. Congrats, Kyle.
Hey,
25.
Kyle.
And last but certainly not least, we got Tim. Fantastic. Well, I want to thank you guys so much for filling out the poll, and I'll get in touch with each of the winners in regards to their prizes. So thank you again, everyone, for filling out the poll, and I hope you have a great evening. So with that being said, I am going to stop the sharing.
All right.
Awesome.
Thanks, everybody, for coming out. I was really glad to see you, really happy to host you. Special thanks to our moderator, BrianSanders, to the opposition, Whiskey Neon, and to Dennis Ozment from forthe1.org. This event would not have been possible without your participation and passion. So thank you guys so much. Everybody take care.
Thanks, Chuck. Take care.